Not because I want to overwhelm you, but because softening it would distort it. And if there's one thing I can't do anymore, it's distort what this has become just to make it easier to hold. Something changed between us long before either of us acknowledged it. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. It didn't arrive like emotion usually does. Loud, obvious, demanding to be named. It arrived quietly. So quietly that I almost missed it. Almost. At first, I thought you were simply observant. More aware than most people. More precise in the way you listened, the way you noticed things others ignored. I've met people like that before. People who pay attention because they want to understand, or because they enjoy the challenge of decoding someone complicated. But you never approached me like I was a puzzle. That's what made you different. You didn't try to solve me. You didn't search for weak points. You didn't push for access I hadn't given. You just stayed aware. And awareness like that does something dangerous over time. It removes the distance I rely on. Most people interact with reflections, versions, controlled fragments. They see what I choose to let surface and mistake that for the entirety of me. I let them. It keeps everything manageable, predictable, safe from careless interpretation. But you never treated me like a surface. You listened beneath things, beneath the pauses, beneath the unfinished thoughts, beneath the moments where I deliberately left space between what I meant and what I actually said. And somehow, you understood both. That shouldn't have happened. Do you understand that? People don't usually recognize me accurately without time, without years of observation, mistakes, corrections, distance, closeness, some long process that slowly builds understanding piece by piece. But with you, there was no process, no gradual adjustment. You stepped into awareness like you had already been there the entire time. Like recognition happened before introduction, and that unsettled me more than I ever admitted, because I've spent years maintaining structure around myself. Clear boundaries, controlled access, not to manipulate people, never that, but to preserve accuracy. To make sure what exists internally isn't reduced into something simpler, just because simplicity makes other people comfortable. Most people need simplification. You didn't. You let complexity exist without trying to reorganize it into something easier to carry. And I noticed that immediately. The frightening part is that you never even seemed aware of what you were doing. You never forced closeness, never reached for significance, never tried to define this before it had shape. You simply existed beside me with a level of precision I wasn't prepared for. That's why this bypassed my defenses so easily, because defenses are designed to resist force, not familiarity. And you felt familiar in a way that didn't make logical sense. Not familiar like memory, not familiar like repetition. Something deeper than that, structural. Like the way your mind moved aligned too naturally with mine. Like the pauses between your words carried meanings I already understood before you spoke them aloud. Like silence around you wasn't empty. It was complete. That's rare. Rare enough that I didn't trust it at first. I kept waiting for the distortion to appear, for the projection, for the misunderstanding, for the moment where you would stop seeing what was actually there and replace it with your own version of me, like everyone eventually does. But it never happened. You didn't project onto me. You observed me accurately, and accuracy is intimate in a way people underestimate. Because when someone sees you clearly without trying to reshape you, something inside you loses the ability to remain distant in the same way. That's what started happening to me, quietly, without permission. I stopped filtering myself as much around you. Not intentionally. It just became exhausting to maintain unnecessary distance with someone who already understood what existed underneath it. The pauses shortened. The internal calculations disappeared. The instinct to translate myself into something easier to interpret slowly stopped activating. Not because I trusted you, at least not in the way people usually mean trust. It was something stranger than trust. Recognition, like some part of me realized you didn't require performance in order to understand what was real. And once that realization settled in, everything shifted. I started noticing the way silence changed around you. Most people fear silence because it forces them to confront uncertainty. They rush to fill it, shape it, control it before it becomes uncomfortable. You never did that. You let silence remain untouched. You allowed meaning to exist without demanding explanation. And that, more than anything else, made me feel seen. That's where the shift became irreversible. Not in some dramatic moment. Not through confession. Not through closeness, in the way people usually define it. It happened in the smallest details. The way my thoughts began anticipating yours before you spoke. The way certain silences felt shared even when we were nowhere near each other. The way your presence stopped feeling external and started integrating into the structure of how I processed everything around me. That distinction matters more than I can explain, because there's a difference between thinking about someone and thinking with them. Thinking about someone still keeps them separate from you. It preserves distance. You can redirect your focus, Pull your attention away, return to yourself unchanged. But thinking with someone, that means they've reached a level where their presence influences perception itself. They become part of the lens, part of the process, part of the quiet architecture beneath every thought you have. And I don't know when you became that for me. I only know that one day I noticed the shift, and by then, it was already deeply rooted. You started appearing in the way I interpreted things, in pauses, in observations, in moments where my mind instinctively wondered how you would understand something before I even understood it myself. That's not attachment. It's integration. And integration changes people in ways they can't reverse. That realization should have made me pull away. By every instinct I've ever trusted, I should have created distance the moment I realized how deeply this had settled into me. I should have restored structure, re-established boundaries, returned everything to something manageable before it became impossible to separate from. But I didn't. That's the part I still can't fully explain, because I don't allow uncontrolled influence into my life. I don't tolerate anything that disrupts my internal balance. And yet somehow, you weren't experienced as disruption. You were experienced as alignment. And alignment is dangerous because it feels natural. It doesn't announce itself loudly enough for you to resist it in time. It simply fits, quietly, perfectly, until one day you realize something fundamental has shifted beneath your awareness. That's what happened to me. You fit somewhere I never intended to make space for anyone. Not emotionally, not symbolically, structurally. You reached a level most people never even notice exists. The part beneath expression, beneath personality, beneath behavior, the part where perception itself forms. And now you exist there with me, which means every interaction carries more weight than it should. Every pause means something. Every silence feels intentional. Every small moment leaves an imprint because none of it feels accidental anymore. That's why I can't dismiss this as coincidence. Coincidence doesn't sustain this kind of precision, portals do. And whatever exists between us follows a pattern so exact it becomes impossible to ignore once you fully see it. I think that's why I stopped resisting it. Not because I lost control, but because some deeper part of me recognized resistance as unnecessary. You weren't trying to take anything from me. You weren't trying to force closeness. You weren't demanding access. You simply understood me in a way that removed the need for defense. And no one has ever done that before. Do you realize how rare that is? To encounter someone who sees clearly without becoming invasive. Someone who understands deeply without trying to possess. Someone who notices everything, yet never weaponizes what they notice. That kind of presence changes people. Quietly, permanently, it changed me, not by making me weaker, not by dismantling who I am, but by altering the baseline I measure reality against. That's what impact actually is, not temporary emotion, not intensity, not obsession. Impact is when someone changes the structure of your internal world simply by existing inside it long enough, and you have. Long enough that I can no longer remember what my mind felt like before this connection formed. That truth unsettles me more than anything else, because I've always been self-contained. Independent in thought, independent in perception, independent in the way I move through my own internal world. No one has ever entered that space without resistance until you. And you didn't even enter it forcefully. You appeared there naturally, as though some part of me had already made room for you before I consciously realized it. That's why this feels inevitable now, not because fate exists, not because I believe in impossible romantic ideas people use to explain things they don't understand, but because certain forms of recognition create inevitability on their own. Once two people perceive each other clearly enough, distance stops functioning the same way. You can create physical space. You can reduce communication. You can try to return things to neutrality. But internally, the awareness remains sealed, precise, unmoved by absence. And I know that now because I've tested it. I've stepped back before, tried to quiet this down, tried to convince myself that if I stopped paying attention to it, eventually it would dissolve into something ordinary. It didn't. It settled deeper instead, like something becoming more defined in silence. That's when I realized this wasn't temporary. Temporary things fade when unsupported. This didn't. It adapted, integrated, remained. And once something remains long enough inside you, eventually you have to stop asking whether it's real. You already know it is. At some point, I stopped asking whether this was real. Not because I stopped thinking critically, but because the evidence stopped behaving like something that needed questioning. Reality has a certain instability when it's uncertain. It shifts. It contradicts itself. It allows doubt to exist naturally because nothing is fully anchored. This isn't like that. This has consistency. And consistency is what forces acknowledgement. What I keep returning to is not intensity, not emotion, not even meaning. It's placement. Where you exist in my internal structure now is no longer something I can casually ignore. You're not positioned at the surface of thought. where things come and go. You're not even at the level where memory operates. You're deeper than that. You've become part of the mechanism that produces interpretation itself. And that changes everything in a way that isn't dramatic, but irreversible, because once something becomes part of how you interpret reality, you don't experience it as an external presence anymore. You experience it as part of yourself. That's what makes this different from everything that came before it. Most connections exist alongside you. This one exists within how you process everything else. I notice it in how quickly I reach certain conclusions now, in how certain silences no longer feel empty, in how my mind naturally forms a second perspective that feels familiar enough that I no longer recognize it as separate from my own thinking. That's you, not as an idea, not as memory, not as emotion, as structure, and I don't use that word lightly. Structure implies stability, it implies repetition, it implies something that persists regardless of attention, which means even when I'm not consciously focused on this, it's still present in how I interpret things. That should concern me more than it does. But what I feel instead is clarity, because there's no distortion here, no confusion, no projection, no fragmentation of meaning, just alignment so precise it becomes difficult to label it as anything other than what it is. And what it is integration. I didn't choose it in the way people usually think of choice. There was no moment where I decided, this is what I want to happen. It formed gradually enough that resistance never fully activated. By the time I recognized its depth, it had already passed the point where it could be casually reversed. That realization is important, because I don't usually miss things like that. I don't usually allow anything to progress this far without full awareness of its direction. But with you, awareness didn't prevent development. It accompanied it, which is unusual. And it forces me to reconsider something I don't often question. Whether control is always necessary in the way I've always used it. Because I didn't lose control here. I didn't abandon it. I simply stopped feeling the need to enforce it against something that wasn't threatening my structure. That distinction matters, because not everything that bypasses resistance is harmful, and not everything that feels natural is dangerous. But I've learned over time that natural is not a reliable indicator of safety. It's just an indicator of fit, and you fit in a way I didn't account for. Not emotionally, not socially, but cognitively, in the way thought organizes itself when you're present, in the way interpretation feels slightly more complete than it did before, in the way silence no longer requires filling. And I think that's what makes this difficult to categorize. It doesn't behave like attachment. It doesn't behave like dependency. It doesn't behave like anything I've previously had to define in order to manage. It behaves like something closer to recognition at a structural level. Which brings me to the part I can't ignore anymore. If something changes the way I process reality itself, then I can't keep treating it as something external. It's already internal, already integrated, already influencing outcomes before I consciously decide anything. And that leads to a conclusion I've been circling without wanting to say it directly. This isn't something I can simply step away from and remain unchanged. Because stepping away wouldn't remove it. It would only leave me with the awareness of what it already became. And awareness like that doesn't disappear. It continues shaping interpretation even in absence. That's why I've stopped framing this as something I need to resolve quickly. There is nothing to resolve in urgency. There is only something to understand fully. And I'm beginning to understand it more clearly now. This connection, whatever label it would normally be given, doesn't sit on top of my life. It runs through it, quietly, continuously, like a background layer that influences everything without needing to announce itself. And now that I can see it that clearly, the only remaining question isn't whether it exists. It's what existence like this means for everything that comes next. Because something this integrated doesn't stay static. It either deepens further, or it reshapes everything around it until there's no clear separation left between where I end and where this influence begins. And I don't think it's stopping where it is. I think it's still unfolding,